Welcome to the second day of the Future Law Virtual Summit. Today we have Thibault Schrepel with us, who is a faculty affiliate at Stanford University Codex Center and assistant professor at Utrecht University School of Law. Now I'll be just shortly representing you, and I do believe that you can actually kick it off even better by yourself. You do have a presentation about the antitrust and blockchain, correct?
Yes, correct.
Perfect. So yeah, tell us something about you that we might not know just yet, and then you can just kick it off with sharing the screen and showing us.
Sure, the famous fun fact. I guess it's not known that I played tennis and I was trained to be a professional player. And my best friend at the time is now world 21, I think, or 22. But he was much, much better than I was. So that's why I'm now a law professor and not a tennis player. And very happy to be with you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I mean, that was an incredible fact that we definitely did not know, and thank you for making that choice. Yeah, so do you want to share the screen?
Sure.
Okay. We now have 15 minutes of a presentation, and then if you're okay, we'll be going into the 15 minutes Q&A.
Yeah, perfect.
All right.
All right. Can you see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
All right, perfect. So yes, hi everybody. I'm very excited, especially for the Q&A as always. So I will try to squeeze my presentation in just 15 minutes. What I want to discuss though in 15 minutes is a real challenge. It's actually a course that I'm teaching over 3 weeks. So I'm not pretending I'm going to be able to squeeze everything, but hopefully you will leave with some insights about antitrust and blockchain. The idea for my talk today is to explain two things. The first is to explain how blockchain could disrupt big technology, knowing that I'm a law professor, so I have no financial interest in blockchain, and I might be wrong. Maybe the technology will disappear. I don't think so, but we'll see. But I guess it's important for us as antitrust lawyers and agencies to keep that in mind. But also I want to describe some of the obstacles that are along the way for blockchain to compete, especially with a tech giant company. So that's the idea. So, so today's talk is part of this series, Rethinking Capitalism for Socio-Ecological Justice. So I thought, well, okay, I'm going to try to do my best to fit this talk within the theme, which here is Rethinking Capitalism. So that's the angle that I took. If you have more questions than I could address during the Q&A, I'm more than happy to engage by email, or we could schedule a Zoom or whatever you think is best. But so the first thing that I want to mention is that antitrust, and actually the hyphen was in the title of my presentation, the name of it comes from being antitrust, not trust in the sense of trusting one each other, but trust in the sense of trustees. So those big companies that were created at the end of the 19th century. And we had antitrust. It appeared with the Sherman Act in the US. And that idea was indeed that the economy should be free from those trusts. And so I'm here to argue that the objective of blockchain is the same. As we know, blockchain, and we heard that so many times, is about cutting out the middleman. And so the idea in the end is to free economic transactions from those intermediaries. And those intermediaries can be trusts. They are trusts most of the time. And so is the objective for antitrust. So that's the big picture. I was grateful to publish actually a paper with Vitalik Buterin that you may know from the Ethereum Blockchain Foundation, in which we argue that basically blockchain and antitrust, they have indeed the same objective, but of course they are trying to reach that objective in totally different manners. And that is important for blockchain communities and antitrust communities because they have some concessions to agree upon. And so here's the biggest difference, I guess, between the two. I mean, obviously one antitrust is what has been called East Coast law, right? The one coming from Congress. Blockchain is West Coast, so that's coding and programming. But at the end of the day, I think that you could actually draw a difference between them two in the fact that blockchain is an architecture. That's the idea of the technology. More than happy to go through the characteristics of the technology in the Q&A. But I guess we can agree on that. Blockchain is laying the ground for future transactions, but the technology itself is not concerned with those transactions. It's concerned with creating the necessary means for those transactions to happen. And antitrust is the exact opposite. Antitrust, at least in theory, and I know we discussed that quite a lot these days about the market structure, but in theory, market structure is not relevant for antitrust. The only thing that matters for antitrust are the behaviors of the companies on the market. So that's the idea of antitrust. And so, of course, if you design a great architecture, it will impact behaviors. Or if you are on the side of antitrust, you care about behaviors, it will imply a certain architecture. So at the end of the day, the two meet one another, but yet they do that in a totally different way. So yes, they can complement one another, but the question, of course, is what about the speed? When can we expect blockchain to supplement antitrust? And we know that we have those tech giant companies for quite a while. And the question is, when is it coming? And if it's not coming soon, what should we do in between? And so what I wrote in the paper is that potentially, and again, I might be wrong, but potentially blockchain may be competing with tech giants way faster than we think. And to some degree, I think it is already. And here it relates to the concept of network effects. So you may be familiar with that. The idea is that the more users are using a product or service, the more you can actually derive some utility in using the same product or service. The telephone is a good example. If there are 2 persons on planet Earth using a telephone, it has almost no value. But if there are 4 or 5 billion persons, then suddenly getting subscriptions, you could derive lots of value from it because you could reach 5 billion person. And so that's network effect. And as we know from empirical economic literature, it takes time. Indeed, if you have 2 persons using a telephone, no value, 100% person, almost no value as well. And it takes time for that to be created. And what we see in the field of antitrust are agencies being concerned that big tech companies can use their power to actually target new startup and new potential disruptors before they can actually reach the critical mass and the real network effects. So that's the idea, and that's what we fear about. Where I think it's different from blockchain potentially is that, as you know, most blockchain, not all of them, but most, they have a token. The token of the blockchain when the blockchain is created is 0. I mean, no one cares. If I'm creating a blockchain tomorrow and release a token, it has no value. But if potentially some users start using the blockchain, then the value of the token is going up. And a good example of that is Bitcoin, of course, which is now, I lost track, but I guess $10,000 or something like that. So if you do that, if you create a blockchain and if you put those tokens on the market, you may create an incentive for users to join the blockchain, although they can actually not derive any proper utility from the blockchain. And that's what you see. It has been called serial monopolies. And you see indeed that blockchain are created, and we hear that all the time. It's the new thing, it's the new Bitcoin. For 3 months it's going well, and then eventually it will disappear. And so you see those sort of monopolies or very dynamic ecosystem. And so here's an example of how it looks like. So I took a random example. I have no idea what really Nexo is. It's a blockchain. And what they say is that, but it's very common, if you join our blockchain, we will give you 3,000 of our token. So you see that you create an incentive for users to join. And I think that potentially might be why blockchain may compete with tech giants in the future. And so this is just a short, those are lots of examples that are blockchain equivalent to big tech services. But I think at the end of the day, it will be a mistake to argue that blockchain will actually replace all of those services and big tech companies and even the firm. To some degree, blockchain is actually creating some new sort of value because it is decentralized, distributed, no middlemen, at least in theory. And that is creating value, right? If no one has control, then you know that you can trust the majority for taking the right decision or not. On the other end, a big tech company has a pilot in the cockpit, and the big tech company may actually decide to change the product, to change the service without the majority, and that could bring some value as well. So I think what we may see is the two competing with one another, but not really one killing the other. So that's the ideal world, I guess. But now I want to discuss in 5-ish minutes the obstacles to that. And I think there are two big obstacles. One is antitrust being infringed within the blockchain ecosystem. And of course, it will trigger some enforcement, and that enforcement may slow down blockchain. But also what you may see is big tech companies infringing antitrust for targeting blockchain and trying to kill blockchain in the nest. So I want to discuss those points very quickly. So the first, using blockchain being infringed, antitrust being infringed within blockchain ecosystem. In antitrust, for those of you who are not familiar, we have two big types of illegal practices. One are collusion, where you need at least two companies to agree to do something illegal. And the other one is, as it is called in the US, monopolization, in which we have one big company abusing its market power against others. For the first, I think we may see companies, and to some degree, I know there are some investigations happening right now in different agencies. We may see some real life companies using blockchain to collude in a more efficient way, using smart contracts or trusting that they can trust the information on the ledger and so on. Again, more than happy to go into detail, but potentially antitrust agencies are concerned about that, and they may want to prohibit certain behavior or to regulate blockchain, and potentially it may slow down blockchain innovation. And it did recently, in the month of August, Makande Raim, who is the Assistant Attorney General, said that indeed companies can use blockchain smart contract to collude. So they are aware of that, and I think it's a good thing. And potentially you may see some enforcement, and enforcement may create a disincentive to keep on investing, or the opposite, we will see. For the second time of behaviors, that's abuses of dominance. And here I think it's very important to make a distinction between public blockchain and private blockchain. A public blockchain, it's the blockchain, almost by definition, it has no pilot. It's the community who's piloting the blockchain. For a private blockchain, it's different. You do have a pilot in the cockpit. And this makes a big difference when it comes to antitrust, and especially to monopolization. Again, the idea of monopolization is one company abusing its market power. So as you can probably not see in this graph, because there are on purpose too many information, but what I wanted to show is that for public blockchain, if you take all the potential abuse of dominance or monopolization, it's very unlikely, because again, there is no pilot. So how can you actually direct your blockchain in a way which is anti-competitive? It's not impossible, but it's hard. For a private blockchain, you have a few companies or a few individuals in charge of the blockchain, and there you may see abuses of dominance. A good example is refusal to deal. Refusal to deal is when a company holds an infrastructure which is essential to get access to be able to compete on the market. Well, as we know, a public blockchain is an open book, so there is no refusal to deal. You cannot prevent someone from buying Bitcoin or buying Ethereum. It's impossible. For a private blockchain, it's almost the opposite. The purpose of a private blockchain is to be able to screen who can enter the private blockchain or not. I'm not saying this is always illegal, but potentially you may see refusal to deal according to the legal tests. So that's one. And my last point is big tech companies infringing antitrust for targeting blockchain. So here's something that we see very commonly in antitrust literature, but also if you read court decisions. Let's say we have two markets, and let's say that market number one is protected by barriers to entry. So a barrier to entry a market could be that you have to put lots of money on the table, or it could be what I described before, which is the network effect. If you want to compete with Google and Facebook, it will be very hard, not only for the money, but also because you have to create a database, and to gather lots of users and so on. But we know that there is something else which could be a market number two, and that's the example of a disruptive innovation. A disruptive innovation is a new product on the market which is creating a new market. And so if you create a new market, you do not really care about the barriers to entry the old market. And so we see that a lot in the field, and especially in the digital field, where some company will create a new market, and that new market, number two, may potentially get over market number one. But the very interesting question for antitrust is it possible for the companies in market number one to target companies in market number two, and therefore to kill competition there? And it might be possible when it comes to big tech and blockchain. And how is that? Well, I think you will not see big tech companies killing blockchain as the layer one, which is the database where you have all the information that everyone can create, and there is no need to ask for any permission. This is called permissionless innovation, right? I can create my own blockchain tomorrow. No one can actually prevent that. But when it comes to the functioning and all the softwares and applications that I may plug on top of my blockchain, there, at some point, if you track any blockchain application, you will see that they go through a centralized service. And a good example of that is the one of exchanges. Let's say I create my blockchain. On top of my blockchain, I put an equivalent to Uber or Airbnb, and someone rents Uber or Airbnb. Well, if those persons want to use my blockchain token to keep on exchanging, fine. But if they want to convert their token into proper dollar or euro or whatever, they need to go through an exchange, and those exchanges are centralized. And if big tech companies, for instance, is holding one of those exchanges, potentially it might be where you will see anti-competitive practices. So I think this is very important for competition agencies to keep that in mind, and to see in the chain of a transaction, where are the centralized actors and what are the behaviors of those actors toward blockchain. This is not something that competition agencies do. Most of the time, they try to create competition by targeting the big tech companies, for instance. And it's rare that they are actually trying to protect market alternatives to those companies. But I think this is the mindset we need to adopt. Otherwise, you will see anti-competitive practices not being punished here in the field. So in the end, I think we can all agree, and hopefully you agree with me, that blockchain and antitrust needs one another. As we know, and if you have studied blockchain and looked into blockchain communities, you see anti-competitive practices. There are a few examples in the US, more than happy to discuss, of anti-competitive practices being implemented within blockchain. And to some degree, technology is doing a great job at decentralizing, but to some degree also, there are some anti-competitive practices where you need antitrust agencies to come and to get rid of. And the same is true for antitrust. Antitrust is not perfect in its ambition to decentralize or to get rid of economic coercion. Antitrust is far from perfect. In fact, we estimate that antitrust agencies detect between 10 and 15% of illegal behaviors, meaning that 90% of anti-competitive behaviors are not being detected. And potentially, blockchain here could help to further decentralize and get rid of economic power. It means, of course, that we need to discuss what are the concessions. Again, happy to discuss that during the Q&A, but that's the core of my message, which was that blockchain and antitrust seek the same objective. Therefore, in my opinion, they should cooperate. And by the way, if you take, for instance, blockchain and privacy, you may argue that to some degree they have an opposite objective, right? The right to be forgotten on the blockchain does not exist. But I think there again, they need to cooperate to find a compromise. So depending on whether the law and technology have the same objective or a different objective, I think at the end of the day, they have to cooperate. But in one case, to further reach the objective, and in the other, to find a compromise between two different objectives. So I've gathered all my papers, everything is open access. on blockchainantitrust.com. You have my email, Twitter, and again, look forward to the discussion, and thanks a lot for having me.
Thank you, Thibault. That was incredible. We do have one question from the public, John Haskell. At some point, or maybe it's just a comment, at some point in conversation, discussion, if of interest, would be curious to better understand how you understand metric for knowing when an artificial versus natural or legitimate form of centralization.
Yes, I mean, and I mean, to some degree, that is the question of antitrust, right? And that's the game we have to play in the field of antitrust, which is when is a practice an artificial form of centralization, or when is it a natural form of centralization? What we made clear in this paper with Vitalik is that for blockchain and antitrust, centralization in and of itself is not a problem. If it's the outcome of competition, then fine. But of course, you want to make sure centralization is the outcome of competition. And what we commonly say in the field of antitrust, I don't know if you work in that field, in this case, you will be aware of that, is that, well, for agencies to get it right, which is to prohibit artificial form of centralization, but not the others, you have to spend lots of resources. And antitrust agencies, they don't have the resources right now to get it right all the time. So it means that they have to take some legal rules, and knowing that it will not get right all the time, well, some legal rules may create some false positive, which is you prohibit a form of centralization, which was in fact the result of proper competition. Or you may be on the other end of the scale, which is false negative, where you do not prohibit a centralization, which is the result of artificial practices. So yeah, I'm sorry I cannot answer your question, but that's again the question of antitrust, and you know, thousands of papers being published every year to try to find the right balance between the two. My perspective is that blockchain is a new technology. It may create some good things. Therefore, potentially, I will be leaning toward creating more false negative than false positive if we have to choose between the two, knowing that Congress will not dedicate billions of dollars to get it right all the time. So, but again, this is just a personal preference. So hopefully I answer your question right now. And yes, again, thank you for the great question.
You actually led me directly to the second question that I had, and you just named one of the, perhaps that was one of the answers already. But what are the legal challenges that the companies are facing today? Because you were mentioning the first market and then the second market that is coming into existence, that is going to disrupt the whole thing. But what prevents the second market from coming into the existence? Are there any legal obstacles on the road, and is the funding one of the big ones?
You mean for the second market to emerge?
Yeah.
Well, I think the way I see it, but again, this is my antitrust perspective, I think the number one issue, well, if you read the survey in the blockchain community, they will tell you that the number one issue is the lack of regulatory framework. And they will like to be sure, which is something which is a bit funny, because in the Silicon Valley with the people I discussed, they say, we don't want to be Uberized, but not in the sense of, you know, creating the sharing economy. Uberized in the sense of first putting a product on the market and then being told that the product is potentially illegal. And they want to avoid that at all costs. And for that, they need proper regulation. So to some degree, I think regulation is needed. I know it's moving in the US, it's moving in Europe, and this is good. But on the business side, I think the number one issue is to create the network effect, or if you want to call it this way, the token effect. If you do not have users, well, maybe your blockchain and your service is incredible, but let's say you do dispute resolution, let's say Aragon blockchain. Well, if you have 10 users, who cares about the outcome of your dispute resolution? So that idea of reaching the critical mass, I think, is the most important. To some degree, you could argue Bitcoin did it, Ethereum did it, maybe a few others, Bitcoin Lite, Stellar, but this is moving. And at some point, I tried to do the empirical work of trying to quantify how many blockchain are appearing every day and how many are disappearing. And I've had to stop after a few hundred per day. So for now, this is number one issue, which is good. It means that the field is dynamic. But probably that's number one issue for market number two to be able to disrupt part of market number one.
All right, thank you so much. We do have another question from Jessica Nemeth Garcia. First off, thank you for the enlightening presentation. At some point you mentioned there are blockchain collusions cases being investigated by antitrust agencies. Perhaps you could briefly discuss the case involving collusion inside the blockchain ecosystem in the US, and what were the legal grounds for this case?
Sure. Well, again, thanks for the great question. So there is one case. Well, the very first case in the US it's a weird case. If you read all the files, you will see that it involves some weird persons, but nonetheless, I think the claims are valid. In the very first case, a person was using Bitcoin.org, which is a forum for sharing ideas about Bitcoin and blockchain, and that person, because of its behavior on the forum, got ejected from the forum, and he claimed that it was an abuse of dominant position or monopolization from the people running the forum, because it was deprived of getting access to the right person in the field for creating a great blockchain. So that's the very first case. Maybe a more serious case, which is still going on, is a case in which one blockchain community were divided into two different parts. One part wanted to increase the size of the blocks for lots of different reasons. The other one wanted to keep the same block, so to put the same number of transactions within each block of a blockchain. Again, for totally different reasons. I think both concerns were legitimate, but what the first group did is that to get over the second one, they changed the rule of the blockchain. And what they did is that they rented some computer power from some Chinese servers, and they put that computer power into their own version of the blockchain, so to be able to destroy the second version of the blockchain, because in comparison, no one was using the second version. So if you were a user, your willingness was to use the first one where you had lots of computing power and not the second one. And so they introduced a claim, the second group, claiming that it was an infringement of collusion, which is Sherman Act Section 1 in the US, where group number one and those Chinese companies colluded to exclude group number two from the blockchain. So that's one case. 2 days ago, we had a case in Chile, which is a merger control case involving a blockchain. And I know that the Swedish Competition Agency is working on one. I suspect that there are more cases in the US. So it's coming to light little by little.
That's amazing to hear that there are so many different cases from all over the place. Also, John is having yet another question, and that is, you raised a difficult question as well, of what counts as real competition versus others. Or take healthcare, are there places we don't want it to be about competition? That's a really cool question, John. Thibault, do you want to?
Yes, again, so probably this question is, I mean, it's a very timely question. 5 years ago, no one in the field of competition law, antitrust, will actually discuss that. We all believe that competition was always great everywhere, and that was the way to run everything. Of course, outside of the field, I'm aware that some people say, well, maybe competition is not always the best solution, but within the field, we never discussed that. For the past 2-3 years, we've been discussing that. In Europe, we had a case, Alstom-Siemens, in which the two companies wanted to merge. The European Commission refused that because of competition issues. And some people starting to say, well, potentially yes, but also if we deprive ourselves of the ability to create some national or European or world champions, potentially that's a mistake. So this, again, I'm very sorry I cannot answer the question in a more precise way, but this is the interaction between antitrust and industrial organization. And the field have been discussed in the 70s, in the 80s, but it has been now back on the map for just 2 years. There are a few empirical studies starting to show up, but it's the very beginning. So if you are interested in this question and you want to publish something about it, it will be read by lots of people because, again, it's very relevant. I think, yes, you may be right. In some places, we do not want competition, but then the game will be to discuss when do we want competition or not, right? How do you draw the line between those two different spaces, which again would be very complex, but very interesting, I guess, as well.
Thank you so much. This has been an incredible discussion, and there's many more questions that we have. Although we will have to switch that to another discussion, and perhaps we can address those at the panel that we're having later on today. But thank you, Thibault, for coming onto this space and making our Future Law Virtual Summit very interesting.
Well, thanks very much for the invitation. Again, you have my email address. More than happy to engage by email. And thanks for having me, and I'll see you in a few hours.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.